Early September 1914, the German war machine, the greatest army the world had ever seen, stood at the gates of Paris. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's audacious gamble for a swift knockout blow against France, seemed on the verge of total success. The French armies were reeling, broken by the speed and ferocity of the German advance. Victory felt not just possible, but inevitable. At the Supreme Army Command, OHL, there was an atmosphere of triumphant expectation. Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke, though suffering from immense stress, believed the decisive moment was at hand. His armies had executed the great wheeling maneuver through Belgium with brutal efficiency. The French, they believed, were spent, their strategic reserves exhausted, their capital city lying open and defenseless. The key to this perceived success was the German First Army, commanded by the aggressive General Alexander von Kluck. This army formed the extreme right wing, the hammerhead of the Schlieffen Plan. It had marched relentlessly, covering hundreds of miles, brushing aside Belgian and French resistance. Now, its spearheads were less than 30 miles from the Eiffel Tower. Paris was within their grasp. German military doctrine was built on the concept of the decisive battle, the Kesselschlacht or Cauldron Battle, aimed at encircling and annihilating the enemy force. They saw the French armies attempting to regroup near Paris not as a coherent defense, but as disorganized remnants ripe for destruction. The final glorious envelopment seemed imminent. The German High Command held the French military leadership in contempt. They saw General Joseph Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, as slow, reactive, and wedded to outdated offensive doctrines. They could not conceive that the French, after suffering such catastrophic defeats in the opening battles, possessed the resilience or the strategic flexibility to mount a credible defense of their capital. Their view of Paris itself was almost dismissive. To the stern, militaristic Prussian mindset, Paris was a city of decadence, frivolity, and revolutionary chaos. They expected its defenses to crumble quickly, its population to panic, and its government to sue for peace the moment German shells began to fall on the city. They were anticipating a repeat of the swift victory of 1870. The problem the French faced was considered insurmountable by German planners. Their main armies were exhausted and disorganized after the long retreat. Their strategic reserves seemed insufficient to plug the gaps. And critically, the speed of the German advance appeared to have outstripped any possibility of the French repositioning their forces for an effective counterattack. German intelligence reports painted a picture of chaos in the French capital. Refugees were flooding the city. The government had fled to Bordeaux. While Paris possessed a ring of old forts, these were seen as relics, easily crushable by the massive German siege artillery that had pulverized the Belgian fortresses at Liège and Namur. The German arrogance was fueled by their own momentum. Von Kluck's soldiers were exhausted from weeks of relentless marching, but their morale was sky high. They could almost smell Paris. Victory felt tangible. Just one more push away. They believed themselves to be an invincible grey tide that nothing could stop. The German plan relied entirely on speed and maintaining this relentless forward pressure. Any significant delay, any unexpected resistance that allowed the French time to regroup could potentially unravel the entire delicate timetable of the Schlieffen Plan. But in early September, they saw no such threat on the horizon. The road to Paris seemed clear. They completely discounted the possibility of unconventional solutions. German military thinking was rigorous, methodical, and deeply rooted in established doctrine. The idea that a decisive strategic move could come from outside the traditional military sphere, from civilian resources, for example, was simply not part of their conceptual framework. The focus was entirely on the movements of large army formations. Intelligence gathering concentrated on identifying the location of French corps and divisions. The logistical capacity of the city of Paris itself, its internal transportation network, was considered irrelevant to the grand strategic picture. A city was a target, not a potential military asset. Von Kluck, in particular, was driven by an almost obsessive desire to destroy the retreating British Expeditionary Force, which he saw as having slipped his grasp after Mons. This led him to make his fateful decision to turn his army east of Paris rather than west, as the original plan dictated, aiming to finally trap the BEF against the Marne River. This deviation was a calculated risk, born of supreme confidence. Von Kluck believed the French Sixth Army, forming near Paris on his exposed right flank, was too weak and disorganized to pose a serious threat. He felt he could ignore it, finish off the British, and still achieve the strategic envelopment. It was a gamble based on contempt for his enemy. The German High Command, receiving fragmented reports from the front, failed to fully grasp the danger of von Kluck's maneuver. Moltke, indecisive and increasingly unwell, allowed his headstrong subordinate commander a dangerous degree of latitude. The rigid clockwork of the Schlieffen Plan was beginning to break down due to human factors. The German worldview saw civilians as passive objects in warfare, as victims or obstacles, but never as active participants in the strategic equation. The idea that the civilian population of Paris, or its resources, could play a decisive role in the coming battle was simply unthinkable. War was the business of soldiers. Their logistical calculations were focused entirely on their own supply lines, which were becoming dangerously overstretched. They assumed the French faced similar, or worse, logistical constraints. They failed to consider that Paris, as a major rail hub and modern metropolis, possessed an internal logistical capacity that might compensate for the disruption of the national network. The German problem, as they defined it, was simply locating and destroying the last remnants of the French field army. They believed that once the French army was broken, Paris would fall automatically. The city itself was not the primary objective. The enemy's army was. This doctrinal focus blinded them to the possibility of a threat emerging from the city itself. The speed of modern warfare, as demonstrated by their own advance, seemed to preclude any possibility of rapid reinforcement. Moving large bodies of troops took days, even weeks, using traditional methods like rail transport or foot marches. The Germans felt secure in the knowledge that they were moving faster than the French could possibly react. The German soldiers advancing towards the Marne River were told that this was the final battle. Nur noch ein paar Tage, just a few more days, was the common refrain. They were marching towards what they believed would be the decisive encounter that would end the war and send them home victorious by Christmas. The German High Command dismissed reports from their cavalry patrols about troop movements near Paris as insignificant. They interpreted them as minor flanking detachments or disorganized reserves, not as the beginnings of a major, coordinated counteroffensive aimed directly at their exposed right wing. It was a failure of analysis driven by preconceived notions. The very idea of using civilian transport for a major military operation was alien to the highly militarized German state. Their own system relied on dedicated military trains and transport columns. The thought of commandeering hundreds of private vehicles for a strategic troop movement would have seemed chaotic, inefficient, and deeply unprofessional. The German fortress of confidence was built on the undeniable success of the preceding month. They had won every major battle. They had conquered Belgium and occupied vast swathes of northern France. Their plan was working. Why should they doubt now? Why should they expect the seemingly broken French to suddenly conjure a miracle? The problem the French faced, a large gap opening between their retreating armies and an exposed German flank driving towards Paris, was, by German calculation, a fatal one. It was the perfect setup for the final Kesselschlacht. The Germans believed they had their enemy exactly where they wanted them. The German leadership was also increasingly isolated from the reality on the ground. Moltke remained far behind the front at his headquarters in Luxembourg. communication was slow and often unreliable. He was trying to conduct a fast-moving modern war using the command and control methods of the 19th century. Their arrogance was also rooted in their assessment of French national character. They believed the French were brilliant in attack, but lacked the stolid, disciplined character required for a prolonged, defensive struggle. They expected the French spirit to break under the relentless pressure of the German advance. The tactical problem seemed insurmountable for the French. How to move enough troops, quickly enough, from the Paris garrison to the threatened flank along the Ourcq River, a distance of some 30 to 40 miles, in time to stop von Kluck's relentless advance? By traditional military means, marching, it was impossible. The German intelligence services, focused on military formations, completely overlooked the potential significance of Paris's vast fleet of civilian motor vehicles. These were seen as part of the civilian world, irrelevant to the grim business of war. They were invisible in plain sight. And so, on September 5, 1914, as von Kluck's First Army confidently crossed the Marne River, turning its back on Paris to pursue the retreating British, the German High Command believed the final victory was just days away. They were utterly oblivious to the desperate, improbable and utterly unprecedented plan that was beginning to take shape in the besieged French capital. The Germans had calculated every military variable. They had counted the French divisions, the machine guns, the artillery pieces. They had factored in marching speeds and railway capacities. But they had forgotten to count one thing: the taxis of Paris. And that omission was about to cost them the war. While the German High Command dreamt of victory parades, a mood of desperate, almost defiant resolve had gripped Paris. General Joseph Gallieni, the city's newly appointed military governor, was a fierce, energetic veteran pulled from retirement. He was not prepared to surrender the capital without a fight. He saw von Kluck's turn east not as a sign of French defeat, but as a moment of unexpected, critical German vulnerability. Gallieni immediately recognized the opportunity. Von Kluck's First Army had exposed its entire right flank to Paris. If Gallieni could strike that flank quickly and decisively with the forces available in the Paris garrison, primarily the newly formed Sixth Army under General Maunoury, he might be able to halt the entire German advance. But time was the critical factor. The problem was immense. Maunoury's Sixth Army was still assembling. Crucially, its 7th Infantry Division, composed of tough, battle-hardened troops rushed in from other sectors, was arriving at the Paris railway stations, exhausted and miles from the developing battle along the Ourcq River, a tributary of the Marne. They needed to reach the front now. Traditional methods were too slow. Marching the troops the 30-40 miles would take at least 2 days, by which time von Kluck might have already crushed the rest of the Sixth Army. The railways near the front were either destroyed or completely congested with retreating forces and fleeing civilians. A conventional solution was impossible. Paris faced a logistical nightmare. It was in this moment of crisis that an idea of startling, almost absurd simplicity was born. Credit for the initial spark is often debated, but it crystallized in Gallieni's headquarters. If the trains could not deliver the troops to the battle, perhaps another form of transport could. Paris possessed one resource in abundance: thousands of motor taxis. The idea was radical, almost comical. Using the city's fleet of Renault AG1 taxis, the iconic, brightly colored cabs of the Belle Époque, to ferry an entire division of infantry to the front line sounded like something out of a Jules Verne novel. It was unprecedented, untested, and logistically baffling. Could civilian vehicles possibly function in a war zone? General Gallieni, a man known for his decisiveness, embraced the unconventional plan immediately. He saw it not as a gimmick, but as the only possible solution to his desperate race against time. He famously issued a terse order: requisition taxis. The military governor was about to commandeer the entire civilian transport network of his city. Executing this order fell to the military police and Gallieni's staff. On the evening of September 7th, 1914, police fanned out across Paris, stopping every taxi they could find. Drivers were ordered, often at gunpoint, to report immediately to the Esplanade des Invalides, a large open space in the city center. No one knew exactly what was happening. The scene at Les Invalides that night was one of surreal, organized chaos. Hundreds, then thousands of taxis converged, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Most were the dominant Renault AG1 model, painted red or green, with their distinctive open driver's compartments and brass radiators. It was a bizarre assembly of civilian life mobilized for total war. The taxi drivers themselves were a mixture of confused, patriotic, and disgruntled citizens. Many were older men, unfit for military service. They were being asked to drive their precious vehicles, their livelihoods, into a potential war zone for uncertain pay and an unknown duration. Yet caught up in the urgency of the moment, the vast majority complied. The logistical plan was improvised on the spot. Each taxi could hold 4 or 5 heavily armed soldiers crammed into its small passenger compartment. The goal was to transport approximately 6,000 men of the 7th Division's 2 brigades to the front near Nanteuil-le-Haudouin, reinforcing Monnery's struggling 6th Army. Around 10 p.m., the first convoy of taxis, headlights blazing in defiance of blackout regulations, began to roll out of Paris. It was an extraordinary sight, a river of red and green cabs filled with grim-faced infantrymen clutching their rifles, driving towards the sound of distant gunfire. The taxis of the Marne were on their way. This was the improbable solution in its purest form. It was born of desperation, improvisation, and a willingness to abandon the military rulebook. It harnessed the existing modern infrastructure of a great city and turned it almost instantaneously into a tool of strategic military transport. It was urban warfare, inverted. The journey itself was slow and chaotic. The roads were clogged with retreating troops, supply wagons, and fleeing refugees. The small taxi engines strained under the weight of 5 armed men. Drivers, unfamiliar with the route and driving in darkness, often got lost. It was far from a smooth military operation, yet it worked. Throughout the night and into the next day, the taxis shuttled back and forth, picking up soldiers from assembly points in the Paris suburbs and depositing them near the front lines. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 600 and 1,200 taxis participated, transporting around 4,000 crucial reinforcements. This number was small compared to the vast armies engaged, but their arrival was psychologically and tactically decisive. They arrived at a critical moment when Monnery's 6th Army was exhausted and on the verge of buckling under German pressure. These fresh troops, delivered directly to the battlefield, were the vital reinforcements needed to hold the line. The solution was controversial even among the French. Some traditionalist officers scoffed at the undignified sight of soldiers arriving at the front in civilian cabs. It seemed amateurish, almost laughable. They failed to grasp the revolutionary brilliance of Gallieni's pragmatic solution. The plan was flawed. Not all the needed troops could be moved by taxi. Many still had to march part of the way, but the taxis provided the critical speed needed to get the core of the reinforcements into position before von Kluck could overwhelm the French flank. It was a victory of just-in-time logistics. The financial arrangement was equally improvised. The drivers were promised payment based on their meter readings. The image of taxi meters ticking away as soldiers were driven into battle became one of the enduring, almost surreal, legends of the event. It was a uniquely Parisian blend of commerce and crisis. This was an underdog solution because it came from outside the established military system. It was not conceived by the general staff, but by a regional commander, using the civilian resources at his disposal. It was a testament to the power of decentralized initiative and local improvisation. The contrast with the German approach was stark. The Germans relied on their meticulously planned military railway system. When that system became overstretched, their advance faltered. The French, faced with a similar crisis, simply invented a new system on the fly, using the tools that were available. The taxis themselves were hardly war machines. The Renault AG1 was a small two-cylinder vehicle designed for the paved streets of Paris, not the rough roads leading to a battlefield. That these fragile civilian vehicles managed to complete their mission is a testament to the determination of the drivers and the urgency of the moment. Gallieni's genius was not just in having the idea, but in having the authority and the decisiveness to implement it immediately, cutting through bureaucratic red tape. In a moment of supreme crisis, he acted like a true commander, using every resource at his disposal, however unconventional. The operation highlighted a fundamental difference between the French and German approaches to mobilization. The German system was rigid and state-controlled. The French system, particularly in Paris, was more flexible, able to tap into the vibrant, sometimes chaotic energy of its civilian society. The taxis of the Marne were not a war-winning weapon in themselves. They did not fire a shot, but they were a war-winning delivery system. They delivered the crucial reinforcements to the exact place they were needed, at the exact moment they were needed most. They were the logistical linchpin of the entire miracle of the Marne. The German High Command remained completely oblivious to this unconventional maneuver until it was too late. Their aerial reconnaissance reported troop movements near Paris, but they had no way of knowing these troops were being shuttled to the front by a fleet of civilian taxis. The sheer absurdity of the idea protected it. This story is a perfect example of asymmetrical thinking. The French, unable to match the Germans in conventional military logistics, simply changed the rules. They used a resource the Germans didn't even consider to be a military asset, urban transport, to achieve a decisive strategic effect. The legend of the taxis grew quickly. It became a powerful symbol of the resilience of Paris and the unity of the French people, l'union sacrée, in the face of invasion. It was a story of ordinary citizens, the taxi drivers, playing a direct and heroic role in saving the nation. So this fragile, improvised and almost comical fleet of civilian vehicles rolled through the night, carrying the fate of France in their back seats. The success of the entire Allied counter-offensive, the battle that would halt the German invasion and doom the Schlieffen Plan, now depended on these unlikely chariots reaching their destination. As the taxis deposited their loads of weary but determined soldiers near the front lines, the stage was set. The reinforcements were in place. The surprise was complete. But how would the arrival of these few thousand men, delivered by such an improbable method, actually impact the titanic struggle raging along the Marne? September 8th, 1914. Along the Ourcq River, the battle raged with ferocious intensity. General von Kluck's German First Army, having turned east of Paris, was now desperately trying to crush the French Sixth Army on its flank before swinging back to deal the final blow. It was a race against time, and von Kluck believed he was winning. His troops were pushing the exhausted French back. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as the French line seemed on the verge of collapse, fresh troops suddenly appeared. Not in disorganized dribs and drabs, but in coherent, battle-ready formations. These were the men of the 7th Division, the very soldiers who, just hours before, had been disembarking from trains in Paris, miles away. German forward observers reported this development with confusion. Where had these reinforcements come from? The railways were cut. There had been no time for a forced march. It seemed impossible. Yet, here they were, plugging the gaps in the French line, their rifle fire adding fresh venom to the defense. The arrival of these 4,000 taxi soldiers was the critical tipping point. they provided the vital stiffening Monuri's exhausted Sixth Army needed to hold its ground. They didn't win the battle on their own, but they prevented a catastrophic French collapse at the most vulnerable moment. They were the finger in the dike that stopped the German flood. Von Kluck was now forced to divert even more troops from his southward advance to deal with this unexpectedly stubborn flank attack. Two entire army corps, originally intended for the final push against the main French armies along the Marne, were now fully committed to the battle against Monuri's army, reinforced by the men who had arrived in Renault taxis. This was the shocking turning point. The German High Command's arrogant dismissal of the Paris garrison and their complete ignorance of the improvised taxi lift had led them into a strategic trap. The flank they thought was secure had suddenly become a raging, resource-draining battle that was pulling their main striking force off course. The German soldiers on the Ourcq front were stunned by the ferocity and resilience of the French defense. They had expected to face broken, demoralized troops. Instead, they faced fresh units, well supplied with ammunition, fighting with a renewed determination. The tide of the battle began to turn, slowly but inexorably. News of the taxis of the Marne spread like wildfire through both armies and then around the world. It was a story of almost unbelievable ingenuity and audacity. It became a powerful symbol of French resilience, the Système D, the French genius for improvisation, triumphing over rigid German planning. This seemingly minor tactical reinforcement had a massive strategic consequence. By drawing von Kluck's two corps northward to fight Monuri, it fatally weakened the German center along the main Marne front. More critically, it opened a dangerous gap, nearly 30 miles wide, between von Kluck's First Army and the neighboring German Second Army under General von Bülow. This gap was the Schlieffen Plan's death wound. Allied aerial reconnaissance spotted it immediately. General Joffre, the French commander, reacting with uncharacteristic speed, ordered the British Expeditionary Force and the French Fifth Army to pivot and attack directly into this gap, threatening to split the entire German right wing in two. Von Kluck now faced an impossible dilemma. His flank was under heavy attack from Monuri, and his rear was threatened by the Allied advance into the gap. His magnificent First Army, the hammer of the German invasion, was suddenly in danger of being encircled itself. The hunter had become the hunted. The German soldiers, who had marched for weeks with the belief that Paris was theirs for the taking, were now suddenly being ordered to retreat. The confusion and psychological shock were immense. Just days before, victory had seemed certain. Now they were pulling back, leaving their fallen comrades behind, the taste of ashes in their mouths. The miracle of the Marne was underway. It was not a single dramatic battle, but a series of uncoordinated clashes along a vast front. But its result was decisive. The German advance was halted, the Schlieffen Plan was dead, and the dream of a quick victory was shattered forever. The war of movement was over. The long nightmare of trench warfare was about to begin. And at the heart of this miracle, playing a small but indispensable role, were the humble taxis of Paris. They had not won the battle, but they had delivered the key reinforcements that allowed the French Sixth Army to hold the flank, which in turn forced von Kluck's fatal deviation, which created the gap that Joffre exploited to halt the entire invasion. A German officer captured during the retreat expressed the bewildering speed of the turnaround. One day, we were marching on Paris, convinced the war was won. The next, we were falling back, with the French attacking us from all sides. We do not understand what happened. It was as if they conjured an army out of thin air. This was the ultimate refutation of German arrogance. Their meticulous, science-based plan had been undone by a combination of factors they had dismissed: the resilience of the French soldier, the skill of the underestimated British, and, most bizarrely, the logistical ingenuity of Parisian taxi drivers. General Gallieni, the man who had dared to implement the unconventional plan, became the hero of Paris. His quick thinking and decisive action were credited with saving the capital. The taxis of the Marne became his lasting iconic legacy. The shock for the German high command was total. Moltke, already under immense strain, suffered a complete nervous breakdown upon hearing news of the retreat. He was quietly replaced as Chief of Staff by Erich von Falkenhayn. The failure at the Marne was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological collapse at the highest level of command. The idea that civilian resources could play such a decisive strategic role was a revelation. It was one of the first glimmerings of the concept of total war, where the entire resources of a nation, military and civilian, could be mobilized and directed towards the war effort. The battle itself was chaotic and bloody. The reinforcements delivered by taxi were thrown straight into the meat grinder, but their presence made the crucial difference. They bought the vital hours needed for Joffre's main counterattack into the gap to take effect. It was a victory bought with courage, blood, and gasoline. Von Kluck's First Army was forced into a rapid and humiliating retreat back across the Marne and then the Aisne rivers. The soldiers who had dreamed of victory parades in Paris were now digging trenches in the mud of Champagne, preparing for a long defensive war they had never anticipated. The French taxi drivers returned to Paris as heroes. Their meters showed astronomical fares, which the French treasury eventually paid. They had participated in one of the most decisive battles in history, not with rifles, but with their steering wheels and their knowledge of the roads out of Paris. This turning point demonstrated the critical importance of logistics in modern warfare. The Germans had been defeated not by superior French fighting power, but by superior French local logistical improvisation at the critical moment. The ability to move troops faster than the enemy could react had proven decisive. The psychological boost to French morale was immeasurable. After a month of disastrous defeats and humiliating retreats, they had saved their capital and thrown the seemingly invincible German army back. The miracle of the Marne renewed the nation's will to fight and settled France in for the long, grim struggle ahead. For the Germans, the shock was compounded by the speed of it all. In just 1 week, the strategic situation had reversed completely. The hunters had become the hunted. The architects of the Lightning War were now bogged down in a static slugfest. It was a failure of assumptions on a colossal scale. The story became an instant legend, embellished in the telling. Some accounts claimed tens of thousands of troops were moved, enough to win the battle single-handedly. The reality was more modest, but no less crucial. A few thousand key reinforcements delivered at the decisive point and time. This was the shocking turning point where improvisation defeated dogma. The French, faced with an impossible problem, abandoned their own rulebook and created a solution out of thin air. The Germans, trapped within the rigid logic of their perfect plan, were unable to adapt to the unexpected. The taxis themselves, the humble Renault AG1s, became national treasures. Several were preserved and are now displayed in French museums, the unlikely brightly colored symbols of a nation's salvation. They stand as monuments to the idea that sometimes the most revolutionary weapon is not a gun, but an idea. The German arrogance, their belief in their own military and intellectual superiority, had been shattered on the banks of the Marne. They had been defeated not just by French courage or British skill, but by the chaotic, unpredictable, and ultimately brilliant spirit of Paris itself. The swift, decisive war the Germans had planned was dead. A new, terrible form of warfare was beginning. But how did this strange, improvised taxi lift actually work? What was the strategic and logistical genius behind this legendary feat, and how did it fit into the larger miracle of the Marne? The legend of the taxis of the Marne often overshadows the complex strategic reality. It was not a spontaneous miracle, but a desperate gamble rooted in sound military logic and enabled by a unique convergence of factors. General Gallieni's genius was not just in having the idea, but in understanding its precise tactical application at a moment of supreme crisis. The key was timing. Von Kluck's turn east on September 3rd had fatally exposed his right flank. Gallieni, monitoring this movement through aerial reconnaissance and cavalry patrols, saw the window of opportunity. He needed to strike this flank immediately, before von Kluck could either crush Maunoury's 6th Army or realize his error and turn back towards Paris. Speed was everything. The strategic brilliance lay in using Paris itself as a weapon. The city was a vast fortress, a huge reservoir of manpower, and crucially, a hub of modern transportation. While the national rail network was collapsing under the strain of war, Paris's internal network, its metro, its trams, and its thousands of taxis, was still functioning. Gallieni weaponized the metropolis. The numbers involved, though legendary, need careful examination. Only about 4,000 troops were moved by taxi, a small fraction of the 500,000 French soldiers engaged in the wider Battle of the Marne. The taxis did not deliver an entire army. They delivered a crucial reinforcement to a specific, critical point on the battlefield, just as it was about to break. It was tactical precision, not brute force. The operation targeted the French 7th Infantry Division. These were not raw recruits, but battle-hardened veterans rushed from another front. Their arrival, even in relatively small numbers, had a disproportionate impact because of their quality and experience. The taxis delivered not just bodies, but a vital injection of combat power and morale. The logistical coordination, though improvised, was remarkable. Gallieni's staff had mere hours to locate, requisition, organize and dispatch a fleet of over 600 civilian vehicles into a chaotic war zone. This required cutting through immense amounts of red tape and relying on the initiative of junior officers and even civilian police. It was a triumph of pragmatic urgency. Why taxis? They were the only available motor transport in sufficient numbers. The French army in 1914 was desperately short of motorized vehicles. Paris, however, boasted one of the largest taxi fleets in the world. Gallieni simply used the tool that was available, regardless of how unconventional it seemed. It was military necessity meeting urban reality. The distance covered was significant. The journey from the assembly points in Paris to the drop-off zones near Nanteuil-le-Haudouin was roughly 50 kilometers each way. The taxis made the round trip throughout the night, demonstrating the surprising resilience of these early automobiles and the endurance of their civilian drivers. The operation exploited a critical German intelligence failure. The Germans simply did not conceive that troops could be moved laterally behind the front lines at such speed using non-military transport. Their aerial reconnaissance saw movement, but failed to grasp its nature or its speed. The sheer absurdity of the method provided its own camouflage. The strategic impact radiated outwards. By forcing von Kluck to divert 2 corps, IV Reserve Corps and 2 corps, to deal with the threat from Paris, the taxi reinforcements directly contributed to the creation of the 30-mile gap between his 1st Army and von Bülow's 2nd Army. This gap was the decisive strategic feature of the entire battle. It's crucial to place the taxi lift within the wider context of the miracle of the Marne. It was one vital piece of a much larger puzzle. Other factors included Joffre's strategic retreat and pivot, the resilience of the French soldiers, the crucial role of the BEF attacking into the gap, and the failures of command within the German High Command itself. The genius of Gallieni's plan was its effect on tempo. In warfare, tempo, the speed of decision-making and maneuver, is critical. The taxis allowed the French to operate inside the Germans' decision cycle. They could reinforce their flank faster than von Kluck could achieve a breakthrough, disrupting his plan and seizing the initiative. The cost of the operation was relatively minimal. Compared to the immense resources consumed by traditional military logistics, railways, horse-drawn columns, commandeering the existing taxi fleet was an incredibly cost-effective solution. The main cost was the fuel consumed and the fares paid to the drivers. The success highlighted a key vulnerability of the Schlieffen Plan, its utter dependence on maintaining forward momentum. Any significant delay, any unexpected friction could cause the entire intricate timetable to collapse. The taxis, by providing just enough friction at the right flank, acted as the grain of sand that jammed the gears of the German war machine. This event marked a turning point in military logistics. It was a dramatic, if small-scale, demonstration of the potential of motorized transport on the battlefield. While armies would remain largely horse-drawn for the rest of the war, the seed of the idea, using trucks and cars to move troops rapidly, had been planted. The operation was also a triumph of civil-military cooperation. It required the military authorities to trust and utilize a civilian resource in a way that had never been done before. The willingness of the Parisian taxi drivers to participate, despite the risks, was a testament to the Union Sacrée, the spirit of national unity that gripped France in 1914. Strategically, the defense of Paris was paramount. Had Paris fallen, the French government likely would have sued for peace, regardless of the state of its armies in the field. Gallieni's actions, including the taxi lift, were not just about winning a battle. They were about saving the nation itself. The Germans had superior heavy artillery, but the French had the famous 75mm field gun. This superb weapon, capable of a high rate of fire, played a crucial role in disrupting the German advances along the Ourcq and the Marne, complementing the infantry's defense. The battle was a complex interplay of different arms. The avalanche effect was subtle but decisive. The arrival of the taxi reinforcements didn't cause a massive German collapse. Instead, it caused a critical stiffening of the French line, which caused von Kluck to commit more troops, which widened the gap, which allowed the Allied counterattack. It was a chain reaction triggered by a few thousand men. The story serves as a counterpoint to the prevailing narrative of World War I generals as unimaginative donkeys. Gallieni demonstrated incredible flexibility, decisiveness, and a willingness to embrace radical solutions when faced with a crisis. He was a commander who understood the resources at his disposal, both military and civilian. The Renault AG1 taxi itself was an unlikely hero. A small, simple, and relatively fragile vehicle, it was never designed for the rigors of military service. Yet hundreds of them performed admirably, shuttling troops under difficult conditions. It was a testament to the robust engineering of these early automobiles. The Germans' failure to adequately use their own motorized transport was a missed opportunity. They possessed trucks and staff cars, but these were primarily reserved for supply and command functions. The idea of using them for rapid tactical troop movements had not yet taken root in their doctrine. The strategic lesson learned was the importance of reserves and the ability to move them quickly to decisive points. The French Sixth Army was effectively Gallieni's reserve, and the taxis were the emergency delivery system that allowed him to deploy that reserve just in time to influence the main battle. The operation highlighted the unique advantages of fighting near a major urban center. Paris provided not just the taxis, but also a pool of manpower, communication networks, and the psychological rallying point that sustained the French defense. The city itself was a strategic asset. The contrast between the planned precision of the Schlieffen Plan and the chaotic improvisation of the taxi lift is stark. It demonstrates that in war, adaptability and the ability to react to unforeseen circumstances are often more important than the perfection of the initial plan. The numbers are worth repeating, transporting roughly 4,000 men over 50 kilometers, While seemingly small, these men arrived fresh and combat-ready, unlike troops who would have been exhausted by a forced march. Their impact on the battlefield was therefore significantly greater than their numbers alone might suggest. The strategic deep dive reveals that the taxis of the Marne were not a whimsical fluke, but a rational, albeit desperate solution to a specific and critical logistical problem made possible by the unique circumstances of the battle's proximity to Paris and the decisiveness of General Gallieni. It was a moment where the civilian world directly intervened to save the military one. The image of ordinary taxi drivers participating in one of history's most decisive battles captured the essence of the nation-in-arms concept that defined the First World War. The operation foreshadowed the future importance of motorized infantry and the concept of rapid deployment forces. While the technology was primitive, the core idea, using vehicles to move troops faster than the enemy can react, would become a central tenet of military doctrine in the decades to follow. We have dissected the strategic context and logistical brilliance of this legendary improvisation. We understand how the taxis made a difference, but who were the men involved? Who was the driver, perhaps apocryphal, credited with the idea? And what was the human experience of this strange journey into battle? The legend often credits a single, anonymous taxi driver with suggesting the audacious plan to General Gallieni. While likely apocryphal, this myth captures a deeper truth. The Taxis of the Marne operation was fundamentally a story about ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, and the surprising ingenuity that can arise from desperation. The true human engine was the collective spirit of Paris itself. At the center stood General Joseph Gallieni, the 65-year-old military governor pulled from retirement just days before. He was known for his sharp mind, his colonial service experience, and his sometimes abrasive decisiveness. Faced with the imminent fall of Paris, he refused to panic. His calm, quick thinking and willingness to embrace an unorthodox solution were the crucial spark. Imagine the scene. Gallieni poring over maps in his besieged headquarters, receiving desperate reports from the front. The railways choked, the troops exhausted. Then, looking out perhaps at the bustling Parisian streets below, the simple, revolutionary connection is made. The city's own circulatory system could become the army's salvation. It was a moment of pure, pragmatic genius. The taxi drivers themselves were the heart of the operation. Most were not young men. They were middle-aged civilians, often fathers, whose livelihoods depended on their Renault cabs. When the police commandeered their vehicles that September night, their reactions ranged from patriotic fervor to bewildered resignation. They were suddenly soldiers in a war they hadn't enlisted for. André Tremel, a Parisian taxi driver, later recalled the moment. "A policeman stopped me. 'Your cab is requisitioned for the army,' he said. I thought he was joking. Then I saw the queues forming at Les Invalides. It was real. We were going to the front. My wife would worry, but France needed us. What else could we do?" The soldiers being transported were men of the 7th Infantry Division, tough veterans rushed from the Eastern Front. They were exhausted from days of travel, expecting perhaps a brief rest in Paris. Instead, they were immediately bundled into the cramped back seats of taxis, clutching their rifles, heading straight back into the inferno they had just left. Their stoicism was remarkable. Corporal Jean Dubois described the bizarre journey. "5 of us crammed into the little cab, couldn't move. We drove all night, headlights blazing, saw refugees on the road going the other way. The driver kept asking if we were scared. We told him we were soldiers. It was his first time seeing the war. He was probably more scared than we were." The drivers faced real danger. They drove towards the sound of the guns, onto roads that were sometimes under shell fire. Their flimsy vehicles offered no protection. Yet, accounts suggest that very few refused the mission. A powerful wave of patriotism, the Union Sacrée, had gripped Paris, uniting citizens from all walks of life in the defense of their capital. The image of the ticking taximeters became a symbol of this strange fusion of civilian life and total war. While likely exaggerated, the idea resonated. It represented the pragmatic, almost businesslike approach the French took to this desperate improvisation. Even in saving the nation, the meter was running. The state eventually paid the fares, totaling over 70,000 francs. Gallieni's staff officers were the unsung heroes of the logistical coordination. Men like General Clergerie worked through the night, improvising assembly points, dispatching orders, and somehow orchestrating the movement of hundreds of vehicles and thousands of men with minimal preparation. It was a masterpiece of crisis management. The operation revealed the surprising resilience of early automotive technology. The Renault AG1 was a simple, robust machine. While breakdowns occurred, the majority of the taxis completed their mission, navigating dark, congested and poorly maintained roads under immense pressure. They were the unsung mechanical heroes of the Marne. The impact on the morale of the Sixth Army was electric. Seeing reinforcements arrive, even in such an unconventional manner, was a huge psychological boost. It was tangible proof that Paris had not forgotten them, that they were not alone. This renewed spirit was as important as the additional manpower. General Monnery, commanding the Sixth Army, was initially skeptical of the plan. But as the taxis began disgorging fresh troops at his hard-pressed front, his relief was immense. These reinforcements allowed him to stabilize his line and continue his crucial attack against von Kluck's flank, buying the vital time needed for the main Allied counterattack. The human engine also included the citizens of Paris. As the taxis rolled out, crowds gathered to cheer them on, pressing food, wine, and cigarettes into the hands of the departing soldiers. It was a moment of profound national unity, a city mobilizing its spirit as much as its vehicles. Think of the contrast. The German army relying on rigid military discipline and meticulous planning versus the French, harnessing the chaotic energy and individual initiative of their civilian population. The taxis represented a fundamentally different philosophy of national mobilization. The drivers were not just chauffeurs, they became participants. Many shared stories of dodging shellfire, of helping wounded soldiers, of witnessing the brutal reality of the front line for the first time. They returned to Paris not just as taxi drivers, but as veterans of a unique and historic military operation. The soldiers, crammed 5 to a cab, endured hours of discomfort. But compared to the alternative, a forced march of 30 miles after days of travel, it was a luxury. They arrived at the front, tired but not physically broken, ready to fight almost immediately. The taxis delivered combat effectiveness, not just bodies. The operation was not without its darker side. Some drivers were accused of exploiting the situation, demanding exorbitant fares or refusing to go all the way to the most dangerous areas. But these appear to have been isolated incidents, overshadowed by the overwhelming spirit of patriotic duty. Gallieni himself became the embodiment of Parisian resistance. His famous proclamation, "I have received the mandate to defend Paris against the invader. I will fulfill that mandate to the end," galvanized the city. The taxi operation became the most visible symbol of his unwavering resolve. The human cost of the wider Battle of the Marne was immense, with hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. The contribution of the taxi soldiers was small in number, but their strategic impact was amplified by the critical timing and location of their arrival. They were a small key that unlocked a very large door. The story resonated deeply because it was so relatable. Everyone knew what a taxi was. The idea of these familiar everyday vehicles being used to save the nation transformed the war from an abstract conflict into something immediate and personal. It was a story everyone could understand and feel part of. The operation highlighted the importance of leadership that can think outside the box. Gallieni's willingness to embrace a radical, unproven, and slightly absurd idea in a moment of crisis is a timeless lesson in military command. Sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones not found in the rulebook. The Renault company, makers of the iconic taxis, inadvertently became part of the legend. Their simple, reliable vehicle was suddenly a national hero. The Taxi de la Marne became a powerful symbol of French industrial contribution to the war effort, alongside the more famous 75mm cannon. Imagine the conversations in the taxis, young soldiers, many seeing combat for the first time, being driven into battle by middle-aged civilians who had never heard a shot fired in anger. It was a surreal microcosm of the entire national mobilization, a blending of worlds under the shadow of imminent invasion. The drivers' knowledge of the Parisian road network proved invaluable. They navigated the complex web of suburban streets and country lanes, often finding quicker routes than military transport columns could have managed. Their local knowledge was a crucial, overlooked asset. This human engine represented the spirit of Système D, the French knack for improvisation and resourcefulness. When the official system failed, ordinary people found a way. The taxis of the Marne were the ultimate expression of this national characteristic, a moment of brilliant, chaotic, and ultimately successful improvisation. The operation was short-lived. Once the immediate crisis passed and the front stabilized, troop movements returned to more conventional military methods, but the legend had been born. The taxis had played their brief, crucial, and unforgettable role in one of history's most decisive battles. The psychological impact on the German soldiers who witnessed or heard about the taxi lift must have been perplexing. It reinforced their image of the French as unpredictable and perhaps slightly mad, capable of desperate, unconventional acts that defied military logic. This entire episode was a testament to the resilience of the French Third Republic. Faced with what seemed like certain defeat, its institutions and its people did not collapse. They adapted, they improvised, and they found the collective will to fight back, fueled by a deep, unwavering love for their capital city. And so, the human engine of this miracle was a unique coalition, a decisive general, adaptable staff officers, patriotic taxi drivers, and exhausted but resolute soldiers, all united by the imminent threat to Paris. But how did the enemy, the architects of the seemingly perfect Schlieffen Plan, react when they finally understood the nature of this bizarre and humiliating setback? The retreat from the Marne was a moment of profound shock and disbelief for the German High Command. General von Moltke, the Chief of Staff, was utterly broken by the failure. His ambitious plan, the inheritance of decades of German military thought, had collapsed in a matter of days. He reportedly told the Kaiser, "Your Majesty, we have lost the war." It was a devastating admission of strategic bankruptcy. In the field, General von Kluck was forced into a series of agonizing decisions. Threatened from the flank by Montgomery's reinforced army and from the rear by the Allied forces pouring into the gap, he had no choice but to order a general withdrawal. His First Army, the pride of the German right wing, was now fighting for its survival, its dream of Paris replaced by the grim reality of retreat. German soldiers who had marched for weeks, fueled by the certainty of victory, were bewildered. Why were they retreating? They had won every battle. This sense of confusion and betrayal permeated the ranks. The psychological impact of turning back when the prize seemed so close was immense and would contribute to the erosion of morale over the long war to come. The official German communiques struggled to explain the situation. They spoke euphemistically of strategic withdrawals and shortening the lines. But the reality was undeniable. The great offensive had failed. Paris was saved, and the war was not going to be over by Christmas. It was a humiliating public admission disguised in military jargon. In post-battle analyses, German staff officers began to piece together the sequence of events. They recognized von Kluck's turn east as the critical error, and they slowly began to understand the unexpected resilience of Montgomery's Sixth Army on their flank. While the full story of the taxi lift was not immediately known, they knew something unexpected had happened near Paris. The role of Allied aerial reconnaissance was grudgingly acknowledged. The French and British airmen had provided Joffre with the crucial intelligence about von Kluck's movements and the resulting gap. The Germans admitted that their own air reconnaissance had been less effective in identifying the threat developing around Paris. They had been out-scouted in the sky. There was considerable bitterness within the German command structure. Von Kluck blamed von Bülow for retreating prematurely and widening the gap. Von Bülow blamed von Kluck for his reckless advance and exposed flank. Moltke blamed everyone. The unified, confident command structure of August had fractured under the stress of failure. The miracle of the Marne, as the French called it, became a source of intense study for German military theorists after the war. They dissected every decision, every movement. While often downplaying the role of the taxis specifically, they were forced to admit the broader point. French improvisation and rapid reinforcement near Paris had been decisive. One German general, reflecting years later, admitted the intellectual shock. We had planned for every contingency based on known military principles. We had not planned for the French to use Paris itself as a strategic weapon, nor for them to move troops using civilian transport. It was outside our realm of thinking. The legend of the taxis, once known, became a sore point for German pride. It seemed to encapsulate their defeat. The mighty German war machine, undone by Parisian cab drivers. It was a story almost too perfectly humiliating, a symbol of French flair triumphing over German rigidity. The most concrete admission was the change in German strategy. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan forced them to accept the reality of a long two-front war. They shifted to a defensive posture on the Western Front, digging the vast network of trenches that would define the next 4 years. The war of movement was dead. The war of attrition had begun. Moltke was swiftly and quietly replaced by Erich von Falkenhayn. This change in leadership was a direct consequence of the Marne failure. It was a public, if unspoken, admission that the architect of the initial campaign had failed catastrophically. German propaganda struggled to maintain morale. They emphasized the vast territories still occupied in France and Belgium. They portrayed the retreat as a tactical necessity. But the initial promise of a swift, glorious victory had been broken, and a seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of the German people. The battle revealed a fundamental flaw in the German war plan, its brittleness. It was a magnificent piece of clockwork, but it lacked flexibility. When the unexpected happened, Belgian resistance, British tenacity, French resilience, the taxi lift, the entire mechanism jammed. It had no capacity to adapt to friction. In their interrogations of captured French soldiers, German intelligence officers began to hear the stories of the taxi journey. At first, they were likely dismissed as battlefield rumors. But as the accounts multiplied, the bizarre truth began to sink in. They had been partly undone by Renault taxis. The failure at the Marne forced Germany into a strategic reassessment. Unable to win quickly in the west, they turned their attention eastward, hoping for a decisive victory against Russia. This shift of focus would have immense consequences, prolonging the war and ultimately contributing to the Russian Revolution. The German army learned a bitter lesson about underestimating the enemy. Their initial contempt for the French decadence and the British shopkeepers had blinded them to the resilience and resourcefulness of their opponents. Arrogance had been their undoing. Post-war German military writing is filled with attempts to explain away the Marne. Some blamed Moltke's weak leadership, others blamed von Kluck's impetuousness. But underlying many of these analyses is a grudging admission that the French, under Gallieni and Joffre, had simply outgeneraled them at the critical moment. The admission was also implicit in their subsequent actions. The Germans never again attempted such an ambitious, timetable-driven offensive on the Western Front until the desperate Ludendorff offensives of 1918. They had learned the painful lesson that Lightning War could be stopped. The sheer relief and jubilation in Paris and across the Allied nations was, in itself, a form of enemy admission. The world had expected Paris to fall. The fact that it had been saved, against all odds, was a global acknowledgement of Germany's stunning and unexpected failure. German soldiers, digging into the chalky soil of the Aisne region, knew the truth. They had marched towards Paris as conquerors. They were now digging in like besieged defenders. The dream was over. The long, grim reality of trench warfare stretched before them. Their letters home reflected this dawning sense of disillusionment. Even the Kaiser, who had confidently expected to dine in Paris by September, was forced to confront the failure. His initial reaction was anger and blame, but the strategic reality was undeniable. His perfect war machine had been stopped. The war would not be short, and its outcome was now terribly uncertain. The story of the taxis became a symbol used by Allied propaganda. It was portrayed as a charming example of French ingenuity versus German brutality. While simplifying the complex reality, this narrative served to further demoralize the Germans and highlight their failure. The German General Staff, though outwardly maintaining a facade of confidence, was forced into a profound internal crisis. Their entire intellectual framework, built on the infallibility of meticulous planning, had been shattered. They had encountered the chaos and unpredictability of real warfare, and it had broken their system. Perhaps the most telling admission was the absence of a German counter-narrative. They had no glorious explanation for the retreat. They could only speak of tactical withdrawals and enemy numbers. They had no answer to the simple, powerful story of the taxis and the miracle of the Marne. Their silence was deafening. The failure to capture Paris in 1914 meant Germany was now trapped in the very war of attrition they had sought to avoid. They were facing the combined industrial might of the British and French empires, a long-term struggle that their pre-war economic planning had never accounted for. The strategic consequences were immense. Reflecting on the battle, a German historian later wrote, "The taxis were militarily insignificant in numbers, but psychologically they were devastating. They represented the moment when the initiative passed from us to the enemy, fueled by a spirit of improvisation we could not match." The German leadership had believed that modern warfare was a science, reducible to calculations of manpower, firepower, and logistics. The Battle of the Marne, with its chaotic improvisation and psychological factors, proved them wrong. War was still, and would always be, a deeply human and unpredictable art. The final admission was the end of the war itself. The stalemate created by the failure at the Marne led directly to 4 years of horrific trench warfare. This prolonged conflict bled Germany dry, leading to its eventual collapse in 1918. The seeds of that final defeat were sown in the first month, partly by a fleet of Parisian taxis, and so the architects of the Lightning War were forced into a slow, grinding defeat. Their arrogance had been broken, their perfect plan shattered. But what would be the lasting legacy of this strange, almost comical, yet utterly decisive moment? How would the legend of the taxis of the Marne shape the memory of the war and the future of military thinking? The Battle of the Marne was not just a military victory. It was a cultural and psychological turning point. The legend of the taxis of the Marne became an enduring symbol of French resilience, national unity, and the unexpected heroism of ordinary citizens. It was the story that proved the Third Republic, often seen as decadent and unstable, still possessed a core of steel. The immediate legacy was the brutal reality of trench warfare. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan meant the end of the war of movement. Both sides dug in, creating the vast, static network of trenches that would scar the landscape of Europe and consume millions of lives over the next 4 years. The taxis had saved Paris, but they had also inadvertently ushered in the age of stalemate. For General Gallieni, the operation cemented his place as a national hero, the savior of Paris. Ding. Though he would die before the war's end, his decisiveness and unconventional thinking became a model for future French commanders. The taxis became his eternal, iconic symbol. The Renault AG1 taxis themselves became relics. Several were preserved after the war, displayed in museums like Les Invalides in Paris. They transformed from everyday objects into sacred artifacts, the humble chariots that had carried France's fate in their back seats. They are tangible links to a moment of national peril and triumph. The operation provided a powerful lesson in the potential of motorized transport in warfare. While the technology was primitive, the core concept, using vehicles for rapid tactical redeployment, was revolutionary. Military theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Charles de Gaulle would study the Marne and envision future armies built around the speed and flexibility of the internal combustion engine. The miracle of the Marne had a profound impact on the morale of both sides. For the Allies, it was proof that the German juggernaut could be stopped. It provided the psychological resilience needed for the long, hard war ahead. For the Germans, it was the first crack in their armor of invincibility, a seed of doubt that would fester over the years. The story highlighted the crucial role of civil-military cooperation in modern total war. It demonstrated that a nation's strength lay not just in its army, but in its ability to mobilize all its resources, including its civilian infrastructure and population, towards a common goal. The taxis were the ultimate symbol of the nation in arms. However, the legend also sometimes obscured the complexities of the battle. The taxis were a vital component, but they were only one part of a much larger, multifaceted Allied effort involving millions of soldiers, brilliant aerial reconnaissance, and critical failures in German command. History often craves simple symbols for complex events. The taxi drivers returned to their everyday lives, but they carried with them an extraordinary story. They became minor celebrities in their neighborhoods, the men who had driven soldiers to save Paris. Their participation connected the civilian experience directly to the heart of the national defense effort. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan had immense geopolitical consequences. It meant Germany was trapped in a long, two-front war against the combined industrial might of Britain, France, and Russia. This protracted conflict would bleed Germany dry, leading to its eventual collapse and the punitive Treaty of Versailles, setting the stage for future conflict. The Marne became a symbol of French élan, but also of French pragmatism. It showed that the French army, often stereotyped as obsessed with reckless offense, was also capable of incredible resilience in defense and brilliant improvisation when necessary. Gallieni's taxis were the ultimate Système D. The German High Command learned a bitter lesson about the importance of flexibility and the dangers of rigid adherence to a plan. The Schlieffen Plan was a masterpiece on paper, but it lacked the adaptability required for the chaos of real warfare. The taxis were a symbol of the unexpected friction that broke the machine. The legacy includes a transformation in the perception of Paris. No longer just a city of art and culture, it had proven itself to be a fortress, a strategic asset capable of generating decisive military action. Its defense became a rallying cry for the entire Allied cause. The story of the taxis of the Marne endures because it is fundamentally human. It is a story of ordinary people, drivers, soldiers, commanders, rising to an extraordinary challenge. It reminds us that history is not just made by grand plans, but by moments of improvisation, courage, and unexpected ingenuity. The operation highlighted the nascent power of the automobile on the battlefield. While horses would remain dominant for years, the Marne offered a tantalizing glimpse of a future where speed and mobility, powered by the internal combustion engine, would redefine the art of war. The financial aspect, the ticking meters, added a layer of almost surreal normalcy to the event. It underscored the idea that even in a moment of existential crisis, the everyday structures of civilian life continued, merging bizarrely with the demands of total war. The contrast between the brightly colored taxis and the grim realities of the battlefield created an unforgettable visual image. It was a clash of worlds, the Belle Époque literally driving into the maw of industrial slaughter. This visual power is a key reason why the story remains so iconic. The strategic lesson for future commanders was clear: understand your environment and use all available resources. Gallieni's genius was recognizing that Paris's taxis were not just civilian transport, they were a potential military asset waiting to be deployed. The failure at the Marne ended Germany's best, perhaps only chance of winning the First World War quickly and decisively. The taxis played a small but critical role in that failure, becoming the unlikely sabots thrown into the gears of the German war machine. The story became a fixture in French classrooms, taught to generations as a prime example of national unity and ingenuity. The taxis of the Marne are as integral to the French memory of the Great War as the trenches or Verdun. The legacy is also about the importance of accurate intelligence. Allied aerial reconnaissance provided the crucial information about von Kluck's movements that allowed Gallieni and Joffre to react. Without seeing the opportunity, the taxis would have remained parked in Paris. This event demonstrated that logistics do not always have to be about massive planned operations. Sometimes inspired improvisation using unconventional means can achieve a decisive effect, especially when time is the most critical factor. It was a victory for agile logistics. The taxis of the Marne stand as a testament to the idea that history often turns on small hinges. The arrival of a few thousand troops, delivered by an absurd method, was enough to tip the balance in one of the 20th century's most decisive battles. The German soldiers who retreated from the Marne carried with them the memory of their unexpected defeat. This psychological blow, the shattering of their sense of invincibility, would linger throughout the war, a constant reminder that their enemy was more resilient and resourceful than they had believed. The image endures. A line of red Renault taxis, headlights blazing, driving through the night towards the sound of the guns. It is a symbol of hope, of defiance, and of the extraordinary things ordinary people can achieve when their homes and their nation are threatened. The legacy is complex. While celebrated as a miracle, the Marne also condemned Europe to 4 more years of horrific trench warfare. Saving Paris came at the price of prolonging the slaughter. History is rarely simple. The story remains relevant today. In an age of high-tech warfare, the taxis of the Marne remind us of the enduring power of human ingenuity, adaptability, and the willingness to break the rules when faced with overwhelming odds. Ultimately, the taxis of the Marne are a story about Paris itself. A city often seen as frivolous proved its core of steel. It mobilized its unique resources, its vehicles, its people, its defiant spirit, and played a direct, decisive role in its own salvation. The German High Command had planned a war of calculation. Gallieni and the Parisians responded with a war of improvisation. On the banks of the Marne, improvisation won. The rigid blueprint was defeated by the chaotic, brilliant, and ultimately successful scramble to save a city and a nation. In the end, the German generals who had confidently expected to dictate peace terms in Paris by September were forced into a bitter retreat. Their perfect plan, the pride of their military science, had been stopped in its tracks, partly by the most improbable cavalry charge in history, a charge executed by the taxi drivers of Paris. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe to Blueprint of Battle for more untold stories.